So, Matthew, in this last discussion, I want to take a step into um, scripture and science and where the normal hot button discussions lead us. I want to start first with the cosmology question. Um, Science is pretty consistent in their answer now about the origin of the universe, not about the agent of the origin of the universe, what set it all in motion, but the Big Bang is a pretty overwhelmingly widely held view of the origin of the universe. Am I correct about that?
Yes, you're very correct.
Okay.
And that's one that surprising, at least is surprising to me, when I have conducted surveys in my classes that I teach of incoming students, there's often more reluctance to believe the Big Bang than even the theory of evolution.
Really?
Or about equal. So there's a huge resistance among a lot of Christian communities to believe the Big Bang theory, at least as they hear it. But as a scientist, there is virtually unanimous agreement that that's the best description of the cosmology, the history, and the origins of the universe. And what's even more interesting to me is if you look at the excuse me, the history of that theory itself, when it was first proposed in the 1920s by George Lemaitre. Most people aren't familiar with that name, but George Lemaitre, I don't know if have you heard of George Lemaitre?
No, the first time I heard of the Big Bang was through Fred Hoyle.
Yeah.
He was the.
He was the one who came up the term, but he was using it to ridicule Lemaitre's theory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Oh,
Lemaitre.
because he was a steady state guy.
Yeah, he was. So, and the reason why he was ridiculing it was the same reason why a lot of people were ridiculing it at the time. This idea of the Big Bang theory, because up until then, the main cosmology that scientists were working with was that the universe was timeless. There is no beginning, and this goes way back to Aristotle. So, you have. Christians throughout the centuries basically saying God must have created a timeless universe. God must have created a universe that looks timeless.
Okay.
And that was the construct that Christians were working
As
with.
opposed to a process, as opposed to a beginning and end.
As opposed to any
Spoke
creation.
it into being and it was there.
Right.
Yeah.
And as opposed to a creation that had any marks of a historical beginning.
Okay.
So there was no just the idea of looking for the beginning of the universe. People thought you were crazy. What do you mean the beginning? The universe
Even though Genesis sounds.
Yeah. Well, and they would say, well, yeah, God maybe created the universe, but he
Right.
created a universe that just appears
Perfect
ageless at its
yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
And so you can't scientifically look for a beginning of the universe is silly. Okay, so when Lemaitre proposes this idea based upon Einstein's new theory of general relativity that the universe has an origin, has a beginning point, also based on the observations of Hubble that show the expanding, the galaxies all moving away from each other, you trace things back.
From which our telescope is named.
Yes, Hubble Space Telescope.
Right.
And you get this idea of a beginning point, and Lemaitre didn't know what that meant. He presented everything kind of in a scientific context of how things could start from one location, very, very hot, very, very dense, and then expand outward. And he really didn't talk about an ultimate beginning or what caused that. But just the scientific idea that there was this origin point of the universe has some history to it was scandalous at the time.
Right.
And there were newspapers published that said, scientists have finally proven the Bible. And because it was so biblical in comparison to the worldview that scientists had before. And so Hoyle, who was an atheist, was kind of ridiculing this theory. He said this Big Bang theory of Lemaitre is obviously wrong. And the name kind of stuck. And even Einstein at first said, well, Lemaitre, your math looks right, but your physics is horrible. And later, as Einstein heard more and more about it, he said, no, actually, this is a beautiful idea, and agreed with it.
Yeah. Now, at some point, a couple of scientists discovered all this background radiation,
Yes.
which was an additional step in presenting this not as just some strange hypothesis, but as a theory that appeared to explain the origins of the universe. So what is the background radiation
So
thing?
the Big Bang Theory is a great example of how scientists as if they continue to look at the evidence, they can be pulled to accept a theory that they don't even they even don't like.
Don't like, yeah.
So the Big Bang Theory is one that was generally disliked by scientists originally, and it took decades before it was finally accepted in the 1960s. Thereabouts. I mean, I think a poll was done in around 1950 where the majority of scientists still rejected the Big Bang Theory. But in the 1960s, a discovery was made accidentally by a couple engineers, Penzias and Wilson, who had a microwave antenna that they were using to communicate with some of the first satellites in orbit, AT&T satellites actually. And they noticed there was this background noise they were hearing wherever they pointed their telescope. An interesting story behind it. First, they thought it was pigeon poop that had clogged their telescope, and they cleaned that out, and they still heard the background noise. And then they remembered, wait a second, there's these guys over at Princeton who were talking about building an antenna to try to detect some sort of background radiation. I wonder if this has anything to do with what they're looking for. And sure enough, this was exactly what that team of scientists was working to discover, and they'd kind of been beat to the punch accidentally by these two engineers. And what they had found was the evidence of, it's essentially the signature of the initial kind of hot explosion of the Big Bang. If you think about the afterglow, the early universe was so dense and hot, it was like the interior of the sun. Their light couldn't travel without bouncing around. It was like a dense fog. You couldn't see through it. It wasn't transparent. But at some point in the expansion of the universe, then that fog clears and things expand enough so that energy can actually travel and photons can travel without being scattered everywhere. And at that point, there's a certain temperature that corresponds to that point. And in all the models of the Big Bang, it had been predicted that this energy would have then spread throughout the whole universe and would have changed over time due to the expansion of the universe and should be detected in the microwave range. And sure enough, that's what was detected, was this background radiation. It was a great confirmation of the theory, and it's what finally won over most scientists. And then as we made better and better observations of this background radiation just in the past couple of decades, we've made more and more refined pictures, and we've seen that this background radiation has the perfect amount of kind of lumpiness in it that matches the Big Bang Theory exactly as it should. Because if things are too lumpy, then you get these black holes everywhere, or the universe collapses back on itself. It doesn't work. The theory doesn't work. And if it's too smooth, then you can't get the stars and galaxies that you need. And so there's this observation of the cosmic microwave background is one of the best pieces of confirming evidence we have for the Big Bang Theory, in addition to just the expansion of the galaxies.
And let me ask you a question, and I don't want to get too technical here, but you mentioned that a lot of scientists were resistant to that idea. Was one of the reasons they were resistant the singularity of this whole process, this idea that it appears to be a one-time event, which would fit with Scripture,
Well, a lot of it was just this idea of a history to the universe originally, because you think about Fred Hoyle's steady state theory was a way to just keep the universe going indefinitely without anything ever changing.
Right. And
his theory had basically matter being created out of nowhere too, but it was in a way to make the universe still timeless. And so that was the main problem that scientists had with this theory. And then when they started, thinking about it more carefully, they realized that the equations did break down when you get to the very beginning point. And there's been a tremendous amount of speculation in the scientific community about what that beginning point really means. But it's really outside of the standard theory at this point. Right. But what the standard theory does tell us is that with this expansion of space, we also have an expansion of time itself. Space and time are linked together. And so this picture that we have of a kind of a beginning point to the universe is also a beginning point to time. And it's a much a more comprehensive beginning than scientists probably would have envisioned, if you'd proposed an idea like this centuries earlier. and yet it also kind of fits the way a lot of theologians were talking about Genesis. In fact, there's a Jewish Orthodox scholar who has written a lot about. He's a physicist, but he's an Orthodox Jew, and he's looked at manuscripts by the Middle Age rabbis Maimonides and Nachmanides, and actually he argues that their interpretation of Genesis and the Genesis account match the Big Bang description very closely in just the way that they talk about the development of matter and energy and light and the stages of all of that.
So talk a little bit more about that now in terms of a Christian interpretation. So we've got this ancient text
Yeah.
that has Genesis 1, Genesis 2, two different pictures of God creating the world. Now, people will do a harmony of those and do all sorts of things with them, but in chapter 1, there's this God speaks and it occurs. In chapter 2, he's forming and shaping man, and there's a different order. He makes man first, then makes a garden to put him in. In the first account, he makes plants and all first, so there's a difference in sequence. So what does a Christian do with that scientific theory of the Big Bang now? I mean, it seems to me to fit fairly well to a picture of God creating the universe. But when you have a student who says, I don't believe that, what's your first response to that?
One of my first responses is go back and read Genesis again. Because I think every time I read Genesis, I see more there. It's a fascinating account. And Christian scholars were struggling with how to understand this text from the very beginning.
They were.
And so it's not like
Augustine is struggling with.
He's struggling with understanding. He thinks the whole, the days of creation is this logical framework that things were created instantaneously. He's wrestling with how do you understand this? Christian scholars have always wrestled with how do we understand this text. And so that's nothing new, and that's almost independent of whatever scientific theory is leading in the day.
I thought Augustine believed in some progression of creation.
No, he believed in an instantaneous creation with a kind of a logical framework that went with it. And so he thought that the days of creation, and it's funny, the language he uses, he says, if you're going to take Genesis literally, then these days cannot be 24 hours. And he makes an argument for that. It's something along those lines.
Yeah.
I'm not a scholar in Augustine, but that's my best understanding of what he said.
Right.
But when there's so much about the Big Bang Theory that, to me, just really fits very, very well with the Christian worldview. But also there's something about, as I kind of knowing kind of in the back of my mind this Big Bang Theory, if I go back to the story of Genesis, I see all sorts of other things in the story of Genesis that what I would say kind of the more traditional, I'm tempted to say simplistic interpretations of Genesis just completely leave out. And I think much of Scripture, really, we can think about this kind of grade school understanding that we have, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we stay there, we miss a lot of what's in Scripture. We miss a lot of the depth of what's there. And now I look back at Genesis and I see all this stuff about God interacting with His creation through the creation process, how He's calling out the land to let the land produce these things. And He's not just saying, let there be abracadabra. He's actually involving creation in the creative action. A lot of it seems to be about what God is doing with created things. And it's an origin story for a people, and not just some sort of cosmology in the sense that we think of cosmology today. Where did all the atoms and molecules come from? This is, where did these people come from? And why are people the way they are? Why?
It's after a different question, isn't it?
It's pursuing different questions.
We're after the scientific question, okay?
Yeah.
But they were not, the writers of the Pentateuch, they were not after the scientific question.
I can say pretty certainly that they were not interested in where molecules and atoms came from, because they didn't know what atoms and molecules were. So, there's all sorts of these scientific questions we can ask today that just would have made no sense to the original audience.
Right.
They didn't even have a vision for how big the universe is. One of the things that modern science has shown us is the bigness of the universe that just, to me, makes God even bigger.
Right.
But it's also the Big Bang forces us to also look at something that you and I have talked about a lot, fine tuning of how certain things in the Big Bang Theory seem to suggest a universe that is just very precisely fitted for life.
And if you're okay going there, I mean, this will be a little
Yeah.
off script, but I had you one time come and speak to a group of pastors in a lunch to learn, or it was dinner or lunch that we ate together at a restaurant, and then you talked to us about the anthropic principle
Yeah,
and the fine tuning of the universe, not as a proof,
yeah.
but as what would you call it? It's not a proof. It's a
Well, I would say that that is the fact that the universe is highly tuned for life. It raises a lot of questions. Is what it does.
Yeah.
It's something that makes a lot of scientists very uncomfortable.
And that was the question earlier I was talking about with the singularity of the Big Bang, with the anthropic principle, that the universe seems to be finely tuned. If the Big Bang was any hotter, there
Yeah.
wouldn't be any carbon atoms, or there wouldn't, certain things have to be, had to be right there. That gives specificity to how we arrived, that leaves lots of questions.
Well, yeah, we live in this immense cosmos with just there's so billions of galaxies and billions of stars in each galaxy and all these different phenomena, and yet there's certain very things that are very precisely fine-tuned within this immense cosmos that if they were just a little bit off.
Give an example of that.
The energies of the Big Bang is one of the ones that's most precisely fine-tuned that I know of, that if they were off a little bit, the energy and density of the early Big Bang, if it was just slightly different, you get a universe that kind of blows itself apart, or when it collapses in on itself. There are certain parameters in the constants of nature that allow for the fusion in stars to fuse carbon and heavier elements, that if these parameters were just slightly off, then stars would not be able to create all of these other elements that you need for anything on the periodic table that's heavier than hydrogen or helium, really, and so you need in order for with the physics that we know to work and to build the history that we see in the universe, you need certain things to be very precisely fine-tuned, and that's forced scientists to ask the question, why is this the case? And for some, the answer is, well, there's some underlying scientific reason why things have to be the way they are, but that seems, so far, has been kind of a dead end. And so the option that a lot of scientists go with, if they want a scientific answer to that question, is, well, there's an infinite number of universes. One of them has to be fine-tuned. We live in the one that is.
Gotcha.
And I don't think that's necessarily anti-Christian, because God could have created an infinite number of universes, sure. But there is a Christian perspective that says if God is going to create a universe, of course, he could tune the parameters. And there are things about our universe that seem tuned in a different way, and that to me is exciting as a scientist, because if you think about not only the conditions that are necessary for life, but also the conditions that are necessary for discovery, there are certain things that seem to be lined up for both in our universe.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think,
I've got for life, but what do you mean by
for discovery, for example, if life could only exist on a planet like Venus with this thick cloud cover that Venus has, what do you see when you look up every night? Nothing but clouds. You don't get an idea of the cosmos. You have no way of knowing kind of how to make these observations about the universe, and unless for just some unknown reason you decide to try to make a rocket, but there'd be no reason, no motivation, there's nothing that you see. And so it turns out that places like that are very inhospitable to life in general. And there are things about the universe that allow us to discover it well. Just even the laws of quantum mechanics, which are behind something called spectral lines, which allow us to look at light that's coming from the other side of the universe and be able to tell what kind of star it came from, how hot the star was, what the star was made of, what elements are in the star, whether magnetic fields are present, and all this stuff is encoded almost like DNA in the light that's coming towards us. And so that property of the universe, that this information seems to be recorded and encoded in ways that we can understand, is a fascinating thing to me as a scientist, whereas I can imagine a universe where that was not necessarily the case. If all light just looked like every other light, we look at a star and the only thing we know about the star is it's a shiny twinkling light. But as it turns out, because of the laws of the universe the way they are, we have this tremendous wealth of information that we can extract. And it seems like the more we dig down, the more information we can extract, and it's amazing landscape of discovery.
It's like it was set up for us to discover.
It's like we, not only, so the message I get from what I've learned about the universe is that not only is the universe designed, but it's designed for discovery.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's fascinating. Dig into another area that Christians, so we've talked about the cosmology, we've talked about the Big Bang Theory, which I've never had trouble reconciling with Genesis. I'm surprised that people do, I guess.
Yeah,
but,
people do.
and the anthropic principle that this universe seems finely tuned to produce life. Let's step into a few minutes for a number of Christians. The whole idea of evolution is a very difficult idea for them. And yet, increasingly, it is just clear that there was a process that was involved in us getting here. So when you have, when you engage a pastor who is resistant to certain forms of the theory of evolution or just the idea of evolution as a whole and dismiss it by saying, you're saying we came from a monkey or something, how do you respond to that as a Christian who believes in God who creates, and as a scientist who believes that there's a process that was involved? What do you do with that?
That's a tougher one for me personally. It's one that's made me more uncomfortable over the years as I've started to discover things, and it's one that I've changed my view on as I've been presented with more and more evidence from my colleagues in the field of biology.
View in which direction?
In the direction of just it wasn't that I felt like certain interpretations of Scripture had to be true, but I had certain ways of interpreting Scripture, and I thought, oh, well, this is definitely an option and I guess one specific one would, I used to think that it was definitely an option for God to have just created Adam and Eve as individuals apart from all other creation, and they aren't necessarily connected with the rest of creation in terms of descent or development, descent. Or even, and so my position on that changed, but then I thought, okay, well, maybe there was this population of pre-humans, and then among them God chose two, Adam and Eve, and from those two, all human beings. And there's actually evidence that kind of argues against all people on earth being descended from two people. And so that's been challenged, and that was, okay, well, and so when I look at, I think, at Genesis now, especially when you think about the origins of mankind, it really is an interesting story because you have this person named mankind.
He's named man in Hebrew. And he marries Eve, who is life.
Life, right. And
they have a child who wanders in the land of wandering, named Wanderer.
And the child builds a city. And is worried about other people killing him.
And there's a talking snake and a flaming sword, and
there's a lot of
tree that you eat and you become wise. And
it's interesting story, and there's a lot of even within the story itself, where if you try to take it too simplistically, it just doesn't work. Right. And where in chapter 5 of Genesis, I think where it says, male and female, he created them and called their name Adam. And so, you have, and then the next verse, Adam is the father. And so you have Adam as them, male and female, and you have Adam as he, the father of Seth. And it's all kind of in the same breath almost. And you have to, I think, understand that there's kind of a larger message in there. And a lot of that, I think, has to, harkens to Luke's understanding of this when he talks about Adam, the son of God. That there is one of the main points of, and it's fascinating because if you go back and look, it never says that Adam is the son of God or God is Adam's father. In the Genesis account, it doesn't specifically say that,
right.
But it's heavily, heavily, heavily implied because you
And that whole
see,
section in Luke 3 begins with the booming voice claiming, "This is my beloved son" at Jesus' baptism, and then goes into the long
yes,
genealogy, and eventually Adam, the son of God, starts with the sonship of Jesus and ends with the sonship of Adam.
yeah.
It's a fascinating.
And even in the just the Genesis account, you have man being created in God's image and named by God, and then you have Seth being created in Adam's image and named by Adam. And so that parallel is just, right there from the beginning. So, that's really important to me, and it's less important to me the exact physical connection that we have. Just like it's not terribly important to me where all the atoms and molecules in my body came from.
Right.
That does not determine who I am.
Right.
Likewise, my ancestry does not determine who I am as a person. And yet it somehow, may have some effects on that. There's this combination of the two.
So again, when we approach an ancient text like this, an inspired ancient text, a text given to us by God, I use the language with Scripture. I will say, let Scripture be Scripture. And if it chooses to do parabolic history, which is real history for
Yeah.
the ancients, if it chooses to use parabolic history, then let it use parabolic history.
Yeah.
So respond to that this is real history.
Yeah.
It's the story of every man and woman, the fall,
Yeah.
temptation, sin, the fall. Creation is true. God has created. It has no science in it.
Yeah.
Okay, but it is a true story, and we're not just saying true without meaning. It is
Yeah.
it is indeed the parabolic history. It's indeed. So would you?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth that's presented in the New Testament about Christ in us that is very, very true. That we can't really pin down in any scientific way, and I think that there's this tremendous truth about the origin stories of Adam and Eve, that if we try to pin down in some sort of scientific way, we're really missing the truth that's in that history. I think it's very important that these characters in Scripture, for me, that I acknowledge that there is some sort of historicity behind them, especially when we get into Abraham and
Yes.
further.
The further we get into Genesis, the more historical it becomes.
Right.
In the way that we tell history.
That's
Would
right.
you agree with that?
I would agree.
We've got about 1 minute, so let you wrap this up. But you would agree with that?
Yeah.
There's a
And-
parabolic history, but eventually Abraham is a real man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the way that we would tell history.
Yeah.
Closer to it.
Yeah, I think that's apparent. And if we had a little more time, I really would I think coming back to the kind of the scientific angle, which is one that maybe I can speak to a little bit more, and just as something that the audience may not know as much about. The evidence out there is pretty strong of this idea of common descent, and there's a lot of misunderstanding what the theory of evolution says and what it and what it means and all of that, and that gets wrapped up in the contentiousness of this. So when we think about our history, there's a lot of things that people tie to evolution that are not necessarily part
Right.
of the theory of evolution.
I'm going to have to wrap us down because
Okay.
we're about to run out of video time. This has been fascinating, Matthew, and I appreciate it. I hope we can come back and do this. Maybe we can pick up where we're leaving off right here.
Right.
Because I know that the folks are, okay, they've got questions. I hope you're
Yeah, we're
writing
kind
them
of left
down.
in the middle of it.
And I thank you. I thank you for your time. I love the way that you honor Scripture, that you honor your Lord, and that you honor science as a discipline. And it's a beautiful thing to be your friend. So thank you, my brother.
Likewise.
Okay.
Thank you.